Welcome. So I wish you could see what this room looks like from my perspective. I always say to Anne, my best friend, partner, and spouse of now 30 years, the night before MLK Day each year, we have this amazing speaker coming, and I hope people show up. And then I'm nervous all morning, and then every year I come, and the place is filled with a wide range of students from every corner of campus. And it just says a lot. It says a lot about this college, but it also says a lot about this generation of students. So thank you. Thank you for being here. MLK Day is always an important day at Denison. In my view, Martin Luther King Jr. remains one of the greatest moral and political philosophers in history. I want to thank Associate Provost and Professor Vivi Lele and everybody at Denison who put time into organizing and making today happen. I also want to welcome Dr. Deirdre Owens. It's a great honor to welcome you as our MLK speaker and to thank you for being here with us today. Dr. King once said, "Let us realize the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." It seems to me that we need to remind ourselves of this statement, especially in this historical moment. Or put another way, this day always seems important, and this year it seems even more important. This country and the world at large needs the words and wisdom of Dr. King in so many ways, in so many contexts, in so many places. Dr. King articulated and fought for a vision of a more diverse America where all people would enjoy the benefits of equality. He was committed to civil rights, to humanitarian values, and to a more just and equitable world. We need more ways to grapple with, to understand, and to make progress on the issues that Dr. King articulated, fought for, and led us on. In particular, we've inherited legacies of race, and we need to be the ones to deal with that legacy in an open and transparent way. This work is hard, it's complicated, and it's messy. It is also some of the most important work we can do together. Dr. King once said, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that." That's the work of a residential liberal arts college, or at least it's the work a liberal arts college should be doing. We have tremendous opportunities on this campus to make Denison a college that others talk about because we have become a place that embraces diversity, equity, and inclusion as a defining value and a core strength. Academic institutions need to be places that are characterized by differences of many kinds, that recognize, honor, and celebrate the value of diversity, and then encourage constructive disagreement as part of the intellectual inquiry, problem solving, and creation of knowledge. First and foremost, this is an ethical issue. Every institution of higher education should be committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of its mission. But it's also a practical issue. Difference helps generate new knowledge and improves the quality of our thought, our ability to be creative, and our capacity to solve problems. It makes our communities healthier, more interesting, and more just. I'm inspired, and I've been inspired now for 7 years, by all the students, faculty, and staff on this campus doing that work. The credit for this work is broadly shared among a range of faculty, staff, administrators, and students who are committed to the work and who are driving change in the areas of the college they can impact. I feel fortunate and honored to be part of an academic community where people care and are always striving to make our community more open, more just, and more forward-looking. Dr. King once commented about education, "The function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Intelligence plus character, that is the true goal of education." Denison's mission is to create autonomous thinkers, discerning moral agents, and engaged citizens of a democratic society. We aspire to educate and graduate students who will be involved in democratic ways of life and who will be citizens who act based on independent thinking and a strong moral core. We immerse students in a challenging, engaging, and broad-based education that develops a set of attributes that allows our graduates to think critically, understand profoundly, and connect broadly. We also aspire to create a way of being in the world. Liberal arts students experience the beauty and meaning of intellectual pursuits, rigorous scholarship, and sharp thinking. The thrill of knowledge for its own sake, and the impact of learning when standards are high and classmates are engaged with course material and with each other. This type of learning extends across our campus. We require our students to live on campus because we believe there's something powerful about living with a diversity of high-achieving peers who are committed to the liberal arts, who want to do well in life, and who want to contribute to things larger than themselves. Students challenge and learn from each other. Students often ask, and I'll end here, what can I do? There's a lot each of us can do. Interact and get to know each other. Go beyond just listening and hearing to also understanding the experiences of each other and how those experiences shape our perspectives and needs in ways that might differ from our own. Have each other's back. I worry about disparaging and hurtful comments directed too often to students, faculty, and staff who come from groups that have historically been underrepresented or marginalized on campus. We need every member of our community to see themselves as belonging at Denison, and we need every member to act from personal and institutional values of being welcoming. We all have a responsibility to be welcoming and to create communities of belonging. We are a college that sees diversity as a source of strength. We are a college that aspires to be a community where every member feels listened to, valued, and respected, to be a community where people seek out those whose life experiences are different from our own, because we see diversity as interesting and fun, and we seek to build organizations and friendship groups that represent the diversity of our college. Dr. King once said, "People fail to get along because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other, and they don't know each other because they've not communicated with each other." Today is about celebrating Dr. King, reminding ourselves about Dr. King's legacy. We always invite a speaker who is carrying on the legacy of Dr. King and who can educate and inform us about the work that's being done, the progress that is happening, and the work that is left in front of us. Today, you're in for a special treat. So thank you for being here. Thank you to our speaker for joining us for this important moment. Thank you to our students for being great Denisonians, and thank you for our staff and faculty for everything you do for the liberal arts. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Tehila.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun.
You may be seated.
I'm gonna hide behind the mountain. I'm gonna hide behind the mountain. I'm gonna hide behind the mountain.
Jesus is the mountain. I know that Jesus is. Oh, he is the mountain. I know that Jesus is. Oh, he is the mountain. Going where those chilly winds won't blow. I'm gonna hide behind the mountain. I'm gonna hide behind the mountain. Oh, I'm gonna hide behind the mountain. Where those chilly winds won't blow. Where those chilly winds won't blow.
The wind won't blow.
Chilly winds won't blow.
Hide behind that mountain.
Chilly winds won't blow.
The mountain is Jesus.
Chilly winds won't blow. Chilly winds
Won't blow.
won't blow.
Chilly winds.
Chilly winds
Won't blow.
won't blow.
Chilly winds.
Chilly winds
Won't blow.
won't blow.
Chilly winds.
Chilly winds
Won't blow.
won't blow. Going where those chilly winds won't blow. Qualche mattina qua sulla moia, qualche mattina qua sulla moia, qua Isola, qua sulla moia, qua Isola, qua sulla moia, qualche mattina qua sulla moia, qualche mattina qua sulla moia, qua Isola, qua sulla moia, qua Isola, qua sulla moia, qualche mattina qua sulla moia, qualche mattina
Qua sulla moia zela, zela, qua sulla moia zela, zela, qua sulla moia,
qualche mattina qua sulla moia, qualche mattina
qua sulla moia zela, zela, qua sulla moia zela, zela,
qua sulla moia, qualche mattina
qua sulla moia,
qualche mattina
qua sulla moia zela, zela, qua sulla moia zela, zela,
qua sulla moia, qualche mattina
qua sulla moia.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Denison. How are you? Oh, great. Welcome. I'm Toni King in Black Studies and Women's Studies, and I am so honored and so pleased to be able to welcome you today to our Martin Luther King commemoration. I want to let you know that I plan to take my time. You heard that before. Yes, I used to hear ministers say that when I was growing up. Often they said it at funerals, and so it may not be appropriate, but yes, I plan to take my time. Dr. Vivi Lele has given me permission to use this podium and this space, and I plan to do so. So let me tell you, first of all, I want to do a robust welcome, because the key to what I want to say to introduce our speaker is that there are many methodologies of remembering. And one of those is to remember to celebrate those of you who are here. So I want to welcome again President Adam Weinberg and Ann Weinberg, to acknowledge the person pulling the strings on so many forms of committees and structures, Dr. Vivi Lele, and also all of the committees that assembled and disassembled and reassembled to pull off this year's commemoration. I also want to welcome our guests from beyond our campus. You are also friends of the college, and you are also home. We are pleased to have you with us. I would like to acknowledge students, faculty, and staff who made our service projects possible today. And for those of you who are students who worked in those projects across the campus, 10 or more projects, doing things ranging from work that will contribute to children's hospitals, service to nursing homes. I'm sure there's a newer euphemism for nursing homes, but I don't know what it is. To projects that would serve our very own Granville first responders, and including such things as the BSU's table outside, so we can express our thoughts, feelings, and reflections. All of this is a part or a kind of methodology of remembering. And finally, last but not least, I would like to acknowledge those of you who will be doing workshops this afternoon following the keynote. Now, I mention these things not to delay the comments of our speaker, but to extend to her the community platform out of which we remember Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Our theme for this year is Until Justice Rolls Down Like Waters: Race, Poverty, Bodies, and the Call to Social Action. It is important to us in commemorating Dr. King's legacy today to keep in mind that we cannot remember, from the Latin memorare, or without being mindful of, without bringing something back to memory. And we cannot commemorate, co-memorate, that's not Latin, without community and a coming together in deep solidarity. Those who have taken my Introduction to Black Studies class, and you know me, you knew I would do this. Those who have taken my Black Studies class have read Dr. Wade Noble's Black Psychology article, a classic from the canon of Black Studies, and he talks about a kind of remembering in which, and I paraphrase a quote from his article, after physical death, as long as a person was remembered and recognized by name, that person would continue to exist in a kind of personal and communal immortality. However, when the last person who knew him also died, then that person was truly deceased. They passed out of the horizon and became a member of the company of spirits. And this is a part of West African cultures. Another methodology of remembering has to do not with whether someone is living or deceased, but in terms of how we talk with each other. A student who came to the Center for Black Studies to visit happened to remark upon, several students came back to talk with great excitement about the breakaway trip, where students, which was co-sponsored by Black Studies and Multicultural Student Affairs. And they talked about how important it is to revisit the sites, to see the artifacts, to re-engage history and their lived experience when they visited those civil rights monuments and settings. And one of the students talked about, or mused about, what it meant, and then ended their musing. And this is a little-known student whose name you probably never heard, Vavel Victor. He said, Dr. King, if history were not so important, why would there be such a need to erase it? Now, this we know to be particularly true and likely to occur when that history is about social movements, social change, social transformation, and the groups affected. The groups who lead those movements and the groups who need that change to occur. So there is a danger in forgetting, and that forgetting and erasure is not a random process in terms of what and who is forgotten and what and who is remembered. And so one of the roles of a historian is to ensure that we do not erase what we need to remember, that we do not move so far away from understanding the problems of the past that we cannot respond to how that history is playing a role in the problems of the present. And it is our historians who engage with great methodological and sometimes tediously precise labor in the act of uncovering and recovering our history. So in the interdisciplinary fields of Black studies and history, our scholars work to ensure that we reclaim that which has been erased, not because the last person living has ceased to remember, but because there are political systems that erase with intent. There are systems of marginalization and the cultural production of anti-Blackness that threaten our remembering. Today, Dr. Deirdre Cooper Owens will help us address our theme, Until Justice Rolls Down Like Waters. The title of her talk, Why We Can't Wait, Reckoning with Racism and Health Inequalities, will be the focus of her talk. And I want to tell you a little bit about who she is. I had a wonderful bio from her, and that has been sent out to you as a faculty and a student body and a community over email. And then this morning, I found a bio that was much more personable that I would like to share. Deirdre Cooper Owens is an award-winning historian and popular public speaker. She is the Charles and Linda Wilson Professor in the History of Medicine and also director of the Humanities in Medicine program at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Now, in this position, Dr. Cooper Owens is one of 2 Black women in the country. And did you see me stand a little taller? Which is hard for me, I might add. She is one of 2 Black women in the country running a medical humanities program, program. She is also director of the program in African American history at the Library Company of Philadelphia, the country's oldest cultural institution. Dr. Cooper Owens believes that the job of the historian is to break the chains of ignorance, one lecture, one book, and one lesson at a time. As a teacher and public speaker, Cooper Owens knows that staying immersed in the worlds that cultivated her growing interest in history is what keeps her not only grounded, but also committed to teaching community-based history. From sitting on the front porch with her granddaddy in Kingstree, South Carolina, while he regaled her with ghost stories about the enslaved in his Gullah Geechee-inflected lilt, listening to working-class Black men and women lovingly play the dozens with each other in her childhood hometown of Anacostia, Southeast in Washington, D.C., Dr. Cooper Owens learned that stories are what draw people into wanting to know about the past. Cooper Owens is proud of her graduate degrees from 2 historically black colleges and universities, the all-women's Bennett College and Clark Atlanta University. Finally, I will share with you that she earned her Ph.D. in history at UCLA and served as a postdoctoral fellow at UVA. And as one of the country's most acclaimed experts in U.S. history, according to Time magazine, Cooper Owens is steadily working towards making history more accessible and inspiring for all. Now, this is where I turn it over with some grand gesture to the speaker. But no, if stories are indeed important, I must add that she fondly, over dinner and numerous times throughout the day, connected with cat lovers based on the point that she has what she refers to as her cat son by the name of Barnaby Jones. Name for a TV show, it's before your time. Now I can welcome Dr. Deirdre Cooper Owens to the platform.
Thank you so much for those wonderful introductions. And so I first have to behave the way my parents taught me, my grandparents taught me, and so I need to thank the people who brought me here. I want to thank President Adam Weinberg and Ann Weinberg for being so gracious, and thank you for those wonderful comments you made at lunch today and also to start this program. Provost. See, this is what you get when you're middle-aged and take your glasses off. So I have to zoom in like this. Provost Copeland, Dean of Faculty Gibson, Associate Provost Dollard Specht, Lele, thank you so much. Dr. Claire Jen, Anna Blank, who's the person who initially issued the invitation, Barbara Faulkner, Tony King for her wonderful remarks, the MLK 2020 committee, the members of TEHILA. I am so grateful to be here. And last but not least, to the students, the faculty, the staff. Where is Robin? Robin Brown. She did an amazing job of keeping, upset. Thank you so much. I mean, just thought of everything to make my trip and stay here comfortable. So I really thank you for your generosity. All right. So Dr. King stated that I tell stories, and I really do. That's what connected me to history. And so if you allow me, I just want to start with the story that connects us to King. I promise I'm going to get to him, but I need to talk about somebody else first. So just imagine, it's September 20th, 1958. We're all in Harlem, New York, in a department store, and we're waiting to get a copy of our book by this young, charismatic Southern Baptist minister signed. In comes 42-year-old Isola Curry Ware. She entered the establishment with a pistol stuffed in her bra and a 7-inch steel letter opener in her purse. She was dressed to kill, and I mean that literally. And she was on a mission. Isola was looking for Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King because the voices in her head told her he was a communist agent working for the NAACP who was not trying to only destroy America, but also to harm her. And so she had to get to King, and so she made her way through the throngs of people there. She focused in on the crowd that had been milling around someone sitting at a table, and so she kind of pushes her way through, and when she sees King, she immediately asks, because she needed to be sure, "Are you Martin Luther King?" So he looks up from signing, and he said, "Yes." And she removes the 7-inch steel letter opener and plunges it into his chest. He was 29 years old. And of course there were gasps and people tried to restrain her. And as people were panicking and King is in shock, the last question she posed to King was, "Why do you annoy me?" Shortly thereafter, as you can guess, authorities apprehended her, she was arrested, and she was interrogated. And after some time, 2 judges found, after her interrogation and test had been administered, that she was mentally unfit to stand trial. She was also assessed at having an IQ of 70. And at 42, she was finally diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenic. Now, until Izola Curry Ware's assassination attempt, others in her small circle, and it was comprised of largely family members, a few friends, they believed her to simply be aggressive, angry, mean-spirited, and quarrelsome. Now, this was a woman who was born in 1916 in a little town of Adrian, Georgia, to a family of Georgia sharecroppers. She was one of 8 children. Like too many young Black people who lived in the Jim Crow South, Izola dropped out of school as a child. She also spoke with the heaviness of a deep Southern accent that others found hard to understand when she spoke. And she was isolated. Right? We don't know if it was by choice or her behavior might have been isolating for others. What we do know later on is that she was not the only person in her family who suffered from mental illness. She had another sibling later on who had also been institutionalized. So as Izola grew, she married, she was separated, and then she left the town of Adrian, Georgia, and zigzagged across the country trying to find work. And so she found a couple of jobs, low-wage earning ones, maybe in a factory here, but largely worked as a domestic, as a maid. And the older she became, the deeper she descended into her psychosis. And so from the moment she attempted to murder the 29-year-old minister, who was a fast-rising star, really, in the civil rights world, she becomes housed in hospitals for the criminally insane until she died in Queens, New York in 2015. A name that we don't really remember. Right? And yet, it was a moment for King to come to grips face to face with the concept that he had learned in seminary, agape love, or this unconditional love. And almost immediately, King says publicly that he forgave her. But he never forgot what happened to him that night in the department store in Harlem. And in fact, his last speech to sanitation workers in 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee, he hearkened back to the moment that Izola Curry Ware attempted to kill him. And he informed the congregation in that church that his team of surgeons told him that the tip of the blade was resting on his aorta. And had he sneezed, it would have pierced his heart and he would have bled out. But because he was a brilliant orator and he had mastered elocution, right, or oration, he applied a rhetorical flourish where he simply stated what he would have missed that night had he sneezed. And so he said, had he sneezed, he would have missed the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Had King sneezed, he would have missed students from the South and all over the country who began a sit-in movement. He would have missed freedom riders coming down to the South to desegregate racist institutions. Had he sneezed, he would not have given his iconic I Have a Dream speech at the Poor People's March, and the list of accomplishments go on. But I want to try that same counterfactual, but this time apply it to the what ifs of Izola Curry Ware's life. What if this woman, who was born into an America that didn't practice anti-Blackness, that relegated far too many Southern Black people to cropping shares of land that were often the sites of where their ancestors had been enslaved, What if she had not been born in that kind of society? What if Izola Curry Ware had access to hospitals that could have helped her with her speech impediment? It's hard to exist in a world where you aren't even understood when the words come out. And what if doctors had taken notice of Izola's symptoms and diagnosed her early on before she became an attempted murderer at 42? What if her family hadn't seen her simply as an angry, mean, and bossy black girl who becomes an angry, mean, and bossy black woman and gave her the opportunity to get medical treatment that she so desperately deserved? Izola Curry Ware represented the violence of a set of oppressive systems that disproportionately affected every group she represented. She was black, she was a woman, she was undereducated, she was poor, she was disabled. And many of those, what we now term social determinants that undermine the health of black people, are still in place. What if Izola Curry Ware was born into a different world? And so those are questions that I ponder as well, because it helps us to reckon with the inequalities that still exist in healthcare. As I was thinking about this talk and thinking about how I would begin it, I started to remember when I was in undergrad. And I remember I had taken a class, it was a political philosophy class, and Dr. Dan Figgins said to me and my classmates at Bennett College, he said, "Facts change, but the truth remains the same." And I always had a smart mouth, and I was like, that ain't true, right? And how's that? That doesn't make sense. The sun is always yellow. That's not gonna change, right? And so we kind of get into this back and forth, and I was like, and what is truth anyway, right? But he didn't tire of me. He had patience, and so he was able to kind of walk me through this process, right? To help me become more nuanced in my thinking. And so what I do know is that facts can change. Facts can change. I could come on stage with a jacket and 2 seconds later take it off, right? So facts change. But there's something about the truth that stands firm, that is unchanging. And so here are some facts that we need to reckon with. In the 21st century, a black woman is 22% more likely to die from heart disease than a white woman. The same black woman is 71% more likely to perish than white women from cervical cancer, and 243% more likely to die from pregnancy or childbirth-related causes than white women. And oftentimes, it's the black women who are blamed. They don't go to the doctor. They're too fat. And I always have a joke. I used to teach at Ole Miss for 5 years. Ole Miss kind of runs a race with Texas and Louisiana as being the fattest state in the country. And I saw a lot of fat white women in Mississippi, right? And the thing is, they weren't blamed. And they didn't suffer the same maternal morbidity and infant mortality rates. They shouldn't have to. In fact, no one should have to. But there's a way in which the health inequalities puts the blame on the victim, right? And not necessarily the institution that's upholding the anti-blackness, the racism, the sexism, and the classism, and all of those other isms. Another fact, if blacks and whites had the same mortality rate today, nearly 100,000 fewer black people would die each year in the United States. In fact, even educated African Americans become sicker and die younger than their educated white peers. A black person will live on average about three fewer years than a white person with the same income. And out of all Americans, black men have the lowest life expectancy of any demographic group, living on average almost 5 years fewer than white men. Now, I could go on and on about the dire statistics that negatively impact the health, the care, the treatment, and the very lifespan of Black people in this country, but I'd be singing a refrain to a song that's been playing for centuries. What can we do to change these grim facts that demonstrate the continual legacy of medical racism, of economic discrimination, and health inequality, where people of African descent, Latinx people, indigenous people, and poor people are literally being snuffed out while we wait for the very people who are suffering to save themselves from the effect of all of the isms. It just is mind-boggling. It doesn't make sense to me. So this is why we can't wait on institutions to keep publishing studies that keep telling us what we know. Many medical practitioners, nurses, medical students, and social workers perpetuate and promulgate anti-Blackness and harbor disdain for impoverished people. If I read another, what I tend to call study that tells me that fat meat is greasy and water is wet, I will pull out the strands of my hair. Because it is something that I've been hearing since I was your age, and now I'm closer to 50 than not. And literally the studies keep replicating the same thing. So then what are we gonna do about this? Right? We can't keep waiting on these folks to keep forming committees and then subcommittees that emphasize diversity and inclusion while people of color, trans people, and poor people keep dying at alarming rates in this country. The studies, the committees mean little if they don't help to create policies and outcomes where we see a drastic reduction in poverty. The maintenance of clean water, physical environments that are healthy for both the body and spirit, the swift punishment of those who would perpetuate racist acts against people, creating a model where people live not longer lives, but longer and healthier lives, happier lives. How do we then continue to narrow the gap between Black and white people or rich and poor people? Time is ticking, and thinking about the current statistics on nearly every group of marginalized people in this country, suffering from some ailment that is either preventable or can be treated with early detection, can literally be soul depleting. But the wonderful thing is, I come from a culture that has emphasized hopefulness. It's the same one that Dr. King comes from. We're both Southern-born folk. And when things seem hopeless, we tend to know how to rely on a kind of spring of hope, right? A wellspring of hope. And so that's what I want to emphasize today. Being aware that we cannot wait with how things currently are means that we must transform the healthcare crisis by placing love and truth-telling as foundational in our fight for social justice. It's not magic, it's not hocus pocus, it's literally how do you learn to care for someone, to heal them if you don't love them, if you don't like them. So we have to place that at the center. Let me begin with a quotation from Dr. Martin Luther King. It's a statement that not a lot of folks are familiar with because it reflects a radical Dr. King, not the one who's been sanitized, disguised, deracinated, and misrecognized for who he really was, a man whose criticism of the status quo and prophetic vision for civil rights, economic liberty, and health equality garnered him detractors from every social segment. Sometimes you all should just Google how many folk disagreed with King when he was alive. Because I wasn't born then, but I'm always meeting people like, I was so inspired by Dr. King. And I was like, how is it that everybody was inspired by Dr. King? But he had so many detractors, right, when you look at the records and you see the pictures. But, you know. The radical MLK stated in spring 1966 before members of the Medical Committee for Human Rights, and this was in Chicago, at their second annual conference, and these were doctors, these were medical practitioners, they were just sick of the inequality, of the racism, of the fervent anti-Blackness that had permeated the country and also the medical establishment. And King, off script, as he often did, stated, "We are concerned about the constant use of federal funds to support this most notorious expression of segregation. Of all the forms of inequality, injustice in health is the most shocking and the most inhuman because it often results in physical death." Dr. King was referencing the pervasive anti-Blackness that the US federal government supported through its funding of Jim Crow hospitals. In my immediate family, I'm 47, I was the first person in my immediate family born in a hospital. Because there were no colored wards for the OBGYNs in Williamsburg County, South Carolina. So my grandmother, my grandfather, my aunt, my mother were all born in homes. This is the pervasiveness of anti-Blackness. And yet the federal government accepted tax money from Black citizens, and yet Black citizens couldn't even go to hospitals. These are institutions just like this beautiful building made of brick and mortar and steel and drywall and all of those. It's inanimate. It's not racialized, and yet someone's own hatred of another group can make someone say that an inanimate object is black and white, as if the hospital knows who's the patient, right? Once again, so King he's going in after the economic question. How dare this government support these kinds of institutions? And so he rebuked those racists who upheld health inequality, as he termed it, against members of the United States' most vulnerable population, because they were essentially sanctioning death sentences for Black people. In his reprimand, I'm a historian of slavery and race in medicine, and so I always go back to these slave narratives that have informed my work. And when I read that quote, immediately I went to an experience of an enslaved woman who had been interviewed decades after slavery had ended, decades after her bondage. And in these interviews, they were called the Works Progress Administration slave narratives, or WPA narratives. And often the interviewers were interested in what daily life was like for an enslaved person. Tell me about your food, the medical care, who were your owners, the overseers, all of these kinds of things. So this one woman was asked about her time in bondage, and he said, well, what was your master like? And this has always stayed with me. It was so simple and yet profound. She said, he was so mean, he studied meanness. And when you have to think about that, to study meanness surpasses, right, brutishness, or it surpasses anything that we can imagine. And so when King is essentially saying, not that this is inhumane, he says inhuman. And it reminded me of studying meanness, that you could be so inhuman in your hatred of equality, in your hatred of democracy, in your hatred of liberation, that your anti-Blackness permits you to allow people to die, and people in their most vulnerable state, sick people, that you can't even go to the hospital because it is an inanimate building, an object that has been dedicated to either white folk or Negroes, but never the twain should meet. And so it's in the same spirit that Dr. King invoked what health equality should be, right? That it should not result in physical death, that it should be about equity, right? Equality for every person who sits under the sun. And so health inequality at that time stood so far outside of what King deemed permissible in a righteous society that he was in essence saying, right, that the white folks studied meanness. And he drew on this rhetorical performance that had a connection to a deep and ancestral knowing about the evilness of those who hated Blackness and Black people so much that they allow a sick Negro to bleed out before that person could be helped at a whites-only hospital. These are the experiences that compelled King to declare Why We Can't Wait in his third book that chronicled the civil rights movement for which he emerged as its most visible leader. That there was no time, right? It's in many ways an extension of the letter from the Birmingham jail. There's no time waiting for moderates to figure it out. We're in a moment of crisis. And so by the time King declared to his critics and white moderates that Black people could not afford to wait for a trickling down of their civil and human rights to be not only acknowledged but also practiced, he had widened the scope of his justice work. This was a person who died in his 30s. And I'm still trying to figure things out, and I'm almost 50, and he got it, right, in his 30s. It wasn't just about whether I can sit at a table and order a cup of coffee or a hamburger. As he started to go, right, to the Midwest and to the North, and he was meeting black folk, like, well, I can eat at the hamburger stand, but I can't afford it. I can't get a good job that gives me a living wage. He had to reconcile, right, himself with his own political myopia, right? I'm asking for something for people who already have access to a thing. But now they need to be able to learn to earn a living wage, to live in a place where the air is free of toxins, to drink water that's clear, to be able to be promoted on jobs. And so he had to widen the lens of his social justice work. And he had begun to understand that one could not advocate for the desegregation of institutions if black people were kept out of the process of having a life that was fulfilled on every level, that was fair on every level. And so the healing needed to be done to the institution that had been perpetuating such racism and classism. And so he recognized every last vestige of racial apartheid needed to be dismantled because its foundation was built on shaky ground. And the work of justice workers was dangerous work. Because you're essentially telling people that the very thing they hold dear is rotten from the core. Can you imagine? America's a democratic nation, but King is saying you're rotten to the core because you're not really democratic at all. In fact, you're hypocritical. I mean, that's bold, and it puts you in a line of fire. And he's also doing this as someone, as many of his contemporaries, his peers, his comrades had done. They're not guaranteed salaries that would garner them wealth. They often weren't covered by health insurance, and they were often the victims of violence of every form. So to exist in a world where the perpetuation of black inhumanity was woven into the fabric of the United States creates a heavy burden to bear emotionally, physically, psychically. And so as I was thinking about this kind of life's work that King, his wife, his contemporaries, Abernathy, I could go on and on with the list of folk, right? That they're putting, Ella Baker, they're putting themselves into. I'm thinking, how in the world do you heal yourself from that? How do others learn to heal you? And then I went to a kind of historical example that I had known about, when I was in elementary school. Every February they would trot out the same stories. I was a child in elementary school in the 70s and the 80s, and they would tell us about these people. But as I was preparing this speech, I thought, let's think about healing and what this actually means. And so 2 examples come to mind. One is the ways in which black folk in these sites of liberation that they created during the modern civil rights era always created what we now term music therapy. Tehillah did it, right? When they were singing the Lift Every Voice and Sing, except I don't know how to harmonize, but I jumped up, I was mouthing it. Dr. Lele can tell you, because I had to learn those words in Anacostia, DC, when I was 6, 7 years old. Every day in my little black school in the hood, we had to sing what was then called the Negro National Anthem. You got up from your seat, you knew every word from all 3 stanzas, right? Because it was a thing that our teachers knew at that moment would bring us into unison, and we felt good about ourselves, despite what everybody else was saying about us, right? And so those folk in those sites of liberation, before every meeting, they sang. And there is something about voices in unison that creates a space for healing. It lessens stress. It reduces anxiety. They weren't saying that this was musical therapy, but they were literally pulling on something that had been taught for generations. When they stood up, they touched each other. They laid hands on each other. There's something that's healing about touch. There's something that calms you, particularly when you know you're getting ready to go out and march and there are people with weapons, sticks, guns, knives, bricks, right, rocks ready to aim at you. But in that space, before you go out to do that dangerous work, people lay loving hands on you. So it made me think of two things. The first was the impact of that for King 60-something years before. In fact, before he was born. So I don't know how many of you have heard of, and professors are not allowed to raise their hands, how many of you have heard of Dr. Daniel Hale Williams? All right. That's troubling, but also I understand why. Dr. Daniel Hale Williams was a black man born in the 19th century who was the first person to perform a successful open heart surgery on a human being, and the person lived, survived. And so this black guy did this in Chicago. And so Dr. Williams moves to Chicago. He is, kind of a rising star, yet he has to, even in Chicago, he has to confront that there is still pervasive discrimination. And so what he's able to do is, through the kind of reaching out to members of the community, even Frederick Douglass gives him money. He builds a hospital and training school for doctors and nurses, in particular black doctors and nurses, but it was interracial, because black doctors and nurses were essentially being rebuffed by white institutions. So he creates and founds the Provident Hospital and Training School in Chicago. It becomes the first hospital in the country with a nursing and intern program that was specifically for African Americans to be hired. But once again, this is a person who did not have racial restrictions. So anybody could be hired, anybody could be served. It was also the first hospital to have an interracial staff. So in 1893, he becomes the first surgeon to perform an open heart surgery on James Cornish, who was a 20-year-old black guy enjoying himself, got caught up in the wrong, the wrong time at the wrong place. Some folks started fighting at a bar. He's just at the jukebox dancing, enjoying himself, listening to his favorite song. He's young, he's nosy. When he turns to look, all of a sudden he gets stabbed, right? He's bleeding out. He's transported to Provident. So this is a hospital that doesn't have an x-ray machine. They don't have any of those kinds of tools and instruments that you need to save lives, but they're used to receiving trauma victims because the white hospitals did not want to deal with a lot of the trauma victims. So Williams uses either a wooden stethoscope or puts his ear up on Cornish's chest, and he says, okay, the heartbeat sounds stable. It's not weak. So he examines, realizes, and by the way, there's no anesthesia used. So he examines him, he sutures up the chest wound, but by the next day, he recognizes that the heartbeat has slowed down, it's weaker. And Mr. Cornish isn't doing well. And so by putting his finger into that suture, he breaks open the suture, he looks, he sees where the tear is, he sews it up. And 51 days later, James Cornish is released. He lives another 21 years after this surgery is done. Pioneers this surgical advancement, transforms medicine. Little did he know 63 years later, the very technique that this black man creates in an institution that was literally the result of anti-blackness, would a white team of surgeons save Dr. Martin Luther King's life. This is the kind of example, right, of institution building, of respecting those who come into your space, not judging him. What were you doing drinking? Why are you at the bar? It was a man who was about to die, and Dr. Hale Williams simply wanted to save his life. He placed love at the center. That was his ethic. of being, and it transformed the way that he healed his patients. And then it made me think about my own experience. In 2015, I decided, after moving to New York from Mississippi, I should say my husband and I decided, after some prodding by my doctor, okay, this is the time, we're gonna have a baby. I was a little bit over 40, I was a little older, but it was fine. So I go and I call the fertility specialist, and I'm excited, and then I find out, because I was living in Manhattan at the time, that you just don't get a fertility specialist. You get placed on a waiting list for a fertility specialist in Manhattan. And so after 2 or 3 months, I'm finally able to see this doctor on the Upper East Side. I go in, and immediately I realize I am the poorest person there. It is for essentially ladies who lunch. And if you live in New York, you can recognize a lady who lunches very quickly. And so I'm in there by myself, and because my husband had to go to work. So, fill out the forms, I do everything. This is one of the top specialists in the city. And every time I would go in, as nice as he was, he would always ask me questions about, it's just so great of you doing this by yourself. And I'm like, I'm married. Most single people don't have 2 last names. And even though I don't have a diamond, I do have a ring on my left, but so I was like, and then finally I was like, people can become mothers without being married. But anyway, that's another story. So every time I'm having to try to prove to this man that I'm somehow, middle class and respectable, it's just ridiculous. So he was always very interested though in, me being a historian of medicine, and I was writing this book and blah, blah, blah. So he does all of these tests, and then I find out, he says, you have cervical stenosis. So I'm like, what does this mean? And so he says, essentially, the opening of your cervix is closed. And I said, so what caused it? He said, lots of things. You could have been born this way, and so that might have been the reason that you and your husband weren't able to get pregnant sooner. You could have had surgery and there's scar tissue. You could have had a sexually transmitted disease. And so he says, but what we need to do is create an opening in your cervix. I said, okay. So he says, so we'll dilate it. Now, I'm someone who's never had a child. Only time I've heard of dilated cervix is for people who are pregnant and about to give birth. So I call every person I know who has given birth, and they're like, oh yeah, when I was 10, so-and-so, and I'm like, I don't care about centimeters and millimeters. I need to know what happens, right? Because I've never had a child, so I don't know. And so they're telling me, and it's not helpful. So of course, right before, about a day or 2 before, the doctor's office calls you and tells you what you need to do. So I was told, take 2 Midol, and you can come into the office and we'll perform it. It's an in-office procedure. It's, okay, take my 2 Midol, 15 minutes before the procedure, I go in. There is the doctor, there is a nurse, and then he takes a duckbill speculum that's typically used to examine the cervix during a pap smear, opens that area, pulls my cervix, I can feel it, and then he takes a long metal washer with a metal brush, and he bores a hole into my cervix for 15 minutes. No anesthesia. It was so painful I couldn't cry. That's how painful it was. Like no tears could come. I just screamed for 15 minutes straight, screamed. And the nurse, I remember looking at her, and she just looked at me with a smirk, like I was being histrionic. And then after he finished, she said, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know it would be that painful. And he said, so keep your legs elevated, and in 15 minutes, you can make your way to the hospital across the street so that we can perform the HSG, so another diagnostic test where essentially iodine is used as a dye to detect if there are any issues when they insert the camera and take x-rays. So after 15 minutes, I thought someone would get me. This is a Tony Upper East Side fertility clinic. Not one person came, so I had to jump down from the table, find the materials to clean myself, coagulated blood and flesh, and find something to stop me from bleeding, get rid of the bed sheet, the paper sheet, and walk myself across the street to the hospital. And I was supposed to teach later that afternoon. And so I get to the hospital, And then I go into, undress, I go into the room, and there's a new set of nurses, of course, the same doctor. And I just remember at the head of the examination table, there was a black nurse. And she looked at my face, and immediately she said, "Girl, I've been there." She was like, "I have 2 babies, I had them by IVF." And then she did something that nobody had done before. She laid hands on me. She literally stroked my forehead. She held my hand, and she talked to me. And the doctor tried to insert the instrument to insert the dye, but my body was so inflamed and irritated that he wasn't able to get it in. So my body rejected it, literally, because I was in so much pain and it had been bruised. And so I remember her saying, because doctors they always seem to be fascinated when I'm the historian of medicine, because I guess I don't look like a professor, at least I try not to. So they're always like, "Oh yeah, she's writing a book, blah, 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 blah." So she, in trying to keep me, calm, she says, "Oh, the doctor says you're writing a book, what is it on?" And so I tell her, and she says, "So you're gonna include this, right?" And I said, No, I'm a historian. We can't talk about our lives. And she was like, "Girl, you better put this in the book." And so I put it in the book. And so, but what it made me think about, though, is the kinds of ways that those fictions about black people have permeated the medical industry. Had it not been for a black man who was literally retaliating against anti-blackness, King might not have been saved in 1958. Had doctors in the 18th and 19th century not created these ideologies that said black people don't experience pain, especially black women, when it comes to their reproductive parts, I might have been given a topical anesthetic. I might have had someone to just look at me and lay hands on me in a loving way, right? And so when these kinds of things are pervasive, black people had to be able to find ways to create ways of loving self-care. And so they did so through the unification of voices, through touch, through creating institutions that were built to sustain not just the members of their community, because they recognized what being shut out did, but that would be a benefit for all mankind. Often as a graduate of HBCUs, I have to tell people who are just ignorant because they don't know. They say, well, and this happens every February, black people got their own racist schools. I'm like, actually, these colleges were created because white people, after the Civil War ended, didn't want black people to go to school with them. But there's no historically black college or university that has ever had a covenant that said that non-black people can't attend. It was literally a response to white people's anti-blackness that these schools had to be created, because they didn't want formerly enslaved people to be in school with them. And then when I said, oh, I didn't know that, I know you didn't. That's my job as a teacher to teach you, right? So I say all of these things, right, to really have us reckon with what this means. Because this is the thing. I was saying this yesterday to Dr. Blank. We know the answers. We've read the studies. We know the stats. Unfortunately, they're kind of unchanging in certain ways. So the biggest thing is to have people recognize that as much as they don't want to admit it, anti-blackness really is a thing. Being classist against poor people is a thing, and it has detrimental effects to the mind, the body, the psyche, but not just for the person experiencing it, also for the person who is perpetuating it. It's violence on both sides. The difference is those who are victimized by it in terms of health, right, we're suffering or either dying early. So what must Dr. King have felt, his wife, his family, his friends, his confidants, to have endured that kind of treatment and to still go out in the world committed to doing the right thing? What must they have felt like to live a life where they were constantly under surveillance, constantly under a gaze, to have your most intimate moments, your indiscretions, your weaknesses, your arguments, everything in your life be assessed, observed, examined, and displayed for public consumption? Lots of things could have happened: paranoia, sickness, distrust, the dependency on things that created an escape from reality. But how does one come out of that kind of environment whole? They simply made sure that they put love into practice in almost everything that they built up. And even when there were those who disagreed with King's message. I think of Ella Baker, right? King invited her to be a member of the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and here was this woman who was smart as a whip, who was literally like a human, I don't know what we call it, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, walking like encyclopedia of knowing everybody. And so he brings her in, and then the men there, including King, wanted to, bring them coffee and act as a secretary and all of those things. And even when she recognized what the cult of celebrity could do to someone with good intentions, she creates another model for which Black folk could also lead. And so she creates a model of leadership that was much more democratic, that didn't have a leader as head, right? So even in that, she could have disparaged him. They made me get caught. No, she was like, there's a better way to counter this. And she specifically worked with younger people. So Stokely Carmichael comes out of Ella Baker tradition once he departs from King. Right? There was still some good that came out of that, right, in a constructive way. And so I'm not saying that everything that they built or supported or did was perfect. Some of these methods upheld hierarchy, patriarchy, homophobia, political myopia, and they were in search of liberation, though. And in search of a liberation that would free everybody. And that is the wonderful thing. They were holding a mirror up for Americans to see that even through the institution of slavery that had existed for centuries in what was then a colonial space that becomes the United States, it had existed longer than even democracy. It wasn't too late for the country to reckon with its own hypocrisy, but to rectify and restore Black people's right to a life where inequities don't exist. We're still working on it, but at least there are those who are fighting the good fight. So in 1966, as King stood before those medical professionals in Chicago that I mentioned before, and who were all ready to transform their field, who were all ready to annihilate inhuman health inequities, King understood the perniciousness of poverty, anti-Black racism, housing discrimination, and health inequalities' deleterious effects on Black people. Today, we have a fancy term for that. We call those intersecting nexuses of negative social health determinants, right? But these are just the things that destroy our quality of life, and they're killing us. And so like King, so like those members of that committee, we refuse to wait to be buried by the weight of this enormous burden. And we listen and act upon the sage words and advice of those who know better. And I often go to those people who are our creators. So I'll end with a poem by Claudia Rankine, who wrote Citizen. And she wrote a poem called The Health of Us in 2014. And it was right before the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, was passed a few years ago. And in The Health of Us, Rankine wrote, "We heard healthcare and we thought public option. We thought reaching across the street, across the lines, across the aisle was the manifestation of not a red state, not a blue state, but these United States. We thought we could be sure of ourselves in this one way, sure of our human element, our basic decency. And if justice was how love showed itself in public, then love was defined by access to care when someone, anyone, thought that cough burned the chest. Was probably nothing, but who knew that fever after 3 days, that inability to breathe, to sleep, to wake in justice and love, we thought we were ready to be just as good, to be better, and despite all the ways we exist alone, no one would be on their own. We were ready to take a stab at a kind of human kind of union. We were ready to check up, to look after in this one way, we were ready. To care for each other, we were ready to see our range of possibilities as a precious commodity, to know every other as another to live in the width of our being, and we weren't ignorant or stupid or naive or idealist or socialist or communist or Canadians. We understood the private options would still keep us alive longer. We understood the private options would treat the disease, not the symptoms. The private options meant access to specialists, to privacy, to elective procedures, to a team of doctors, to radiology imaging, to brand name drugs. We understood the impossibility of real equality, but this single shift toward a national community, we thought, despite being founded on genocide and sustained by slavery in God's country, we thought we were ready to see sanity inside the humanity. We thought the improbability of the face on Capitol Hill meant possibility. And in less eloquent terms, I simply say, this is why we can't wait. This is why we cannot wait to transform healthcare. This is why we cannot wait for the liberatory practice that values Black lives in particular, because according to the statistics, these are the ones that are suffering and dying. Doesn't mean that we are placing other lives on the margins, but what it means is that when people are undergoing a crisis, whereas King said, the sentence is death, we have to be able to push aside our pride, push aside our own egos, and recognize that we have to reckon with transforming our healthcare crisis. So I thank you so much for having me here. I don't know if we're opening up to the floor to questions or not. So I will just pass it on to my facilitators, but I thank you so much for your time, your attention, and for having me here at Denison.